Hello. Today I want to talk about the early church apologists, these early defenders of the faith. Now, they mostly come in the second century or the 100s, and most of them were writing stuff to emperors or governing officials during the reigns of Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. There were some that were earlier than that and some that were a bit later, but most of them tend to fall within that bracket. Now, during the second century, there's kind of three different types of church writings that have come down to us. And so I want to tell you about those three groups that I'm kind of classifying here so we can understand how the apologists kind of stand out as a group. So the first group would be the apostolics. A lot of scholars, there's a group of will kind of classify a group of writings called the Apostolic Fathers. These are people who may have known specific apostles directly. People like Polycarp and Ignatius allegedly were discipled by the Apostle John. Clement of Rome, for example, allegedly traveled with Paul and things like that in those writings. So these are called apostolics, and they're continuing that tradition of what the apostles were doing, encouraging churches, dealing with specific disputes within churches. Maybe this church in Corinth is still having some issues, and so Clement wrote a letter to them, and things like that. Another group of writings are what I'm going to call theological writings, and we're going to get into that when we get into Irenaeus. He is one of the first ones to, or earliest one of, to start developing Christian doctrine in a context of within the church, dealing with doctrinal disputes and starting to develop this notion of heresy that later developed, or he actually uses the word in his book against heresies. But the focus there is within the church. It's internal problems, speaking internally. Now, the apologists are different from the theological writings in the sense that they're speaking outside. They're dealing with external problems. So they're writing to the emperors, to governing officials, to pagans who are writing treatises, and also to the Jews. At this time, there were no longer any Jews within the church. And so the Jews were accusing the Christians as this extra separate group and accusing them because the Christians were claiming the Jewish scriptures as their own. And so the Jews didn't like this and so forth. And we get books like Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, in distinguishing the Christian faith from the Jewish faith and things like that. So what is apologetics? What were these apologists doing? Now, before we go too far, I want to distinguish what they were doing from what happens in the modern world with apologetics. Now, if you know me well, you know I really don't like apologetics. I'm not a fan of it. I don't like it. If you say, hey, Nathan, there's this apologetics conference or something, I might roll my eyes or try to do something a little bit more polite to you, but I don't like apologetics. A good friend of mine has a master's in apologetics, and I respect him and love him. He's a great, godly man, and we've had some debates about this, and he would probably say that I'm misrepresenting modern apologetics, and that's a fair critique, but I still don't really like it. Anyways, the focus for modern apologetics is really all about proving God, proving God's existence, and tends to gear towards philosophical arguments and scientific arguments to prove God's existence. One of the philosophical arguments, of course, is the evil good argument. If you call this evil, then there obviously is something good, ergo God. Personally, I think there's too many logical leaps that have to happen in there that it's not a very good argument especially when you consider things like ancient Greek contexts and stuff. They didn't believe in God. A lot of them were atheistic, and yet they actually had a very strong set moralistic framework that most Christians would agree with in many ways. Not every way, but many ways. Anyways, that aside, I'm not much a fan of it. So why do I like these early apologists? Because I do. I love these early apologists. Why do I like them, yet I don't like the modern apologetics? The reason is because they're doing something very different. these early apologists or second century apologists, they're not really trying to prove God, rather they're trying to explain the faith. Father John Bear, a church historian and theologian, he says this about the apologists and about what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. He says, in this period, confronted with persecution, prejudice, and popular slander, Christian writers had to defend to the state the right of Christianity to exist, to present a reasoned account of their beliefs to the educated classes from which they were beginning to gain converts, and to dispel common misconceptions of their rites and practices. The main thing that they were dealing with was that Christianity was assumed to be a horrible thing, a terrible or a malicious or a debauched superstition. And so they had to explain, no, this is really what Christianity is, because no one knew what it was. Very different from today. Almost everyone and their dog knows Christianity. They obviously probably don't fully understand what Christianity really is about, but they know a Christian. Back in the early 2nd century, you could encounter many people who had never encountered a Christian. They may have heard the name Christian, but they probably didn't know much about it. And if they did, it was just the random rumors that they just threw off. Like for me, I've never met a Wiccan personally. But that doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate recognized religion. And it's more of just not very popular right now. It's not really a fair comparison, but to try to help illustrate this. Another church historian, Robert Louis Wilkin, puts it this way about what they were doing. When he's talking about Justin Martyr, he says that, to try to sum up what Justin Martyr was saying, the way to God begins not with arguments or proofs, but with discernment and faith. The ability to see what is disclosed in events and the readiness to trust the words of those who testify to them. So these apologists were not trying to make converts with their apologetics. Rather, they were trying to say, hey, governing officials, we're a legitimate, peaceful group that should have the right to practice just like any other religion does. They weren't trying to convert their audience. They were trying to explain the faith, just to kind of set up Christianity as a legitimate religion within the religious diversity of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. So at this time, Christianity is growing. It's very small, like I've been saying, but it's starting to develop its own social voice. And it is growing. Some of the educated elite are now starting to become Christians. And so now we have people that are able and equipped and trained in rhetoric and philosophy and things like this to present these arguments. Also, some of them might be connected politically, so actually have an ability to access the emperor rather than a bunch of low-class people in the Roman Empire, like slaves and whatnot, who wouldn't really have access to things like this. Now a whole bunch of people are now being converted to Christianity who have access and ability to do this, and that's where the apologists start coming in. Now, a bit of a caveat to point out is that Christianity wasn't necessarily being universally persecuted at this time. Contrary to even myself and what I thought growing up, Nero, for example, his persecution, as horrible as it was isolated to Rome. He wasn't doing any of that kind of persecution outside of the city of Rome. If you were a Christian and lived even in a nearby city or town, you were not being persecuted, likely. Maybe, but not likely. Now, other parts of the government, it's kind of scattered. What is the governor? What does the city proctor? What does he decide to do? How does he decide to treat the Christians? There was an aura and kind of this atmosphere that Christianity was suspicious and sometimes considered illegal, but most of the time people weren't being hunted. It was just, if your neighbor didn't like you, they could go to the governor and say, hey, this guy's a Christian. And then the governor would roll his eyes, be like, all right, I guess I have to arrest him now. That kind of situation. So it wasn't good for Christians, but at the same time, it wasn't this widespread universal persecution. Yes, there was a period with widespread persecution, but that didn't happen still for another 100 years after this. Christianity still is rather small, and most people just don't care. Now, why did people not like it? Why would it even be considered suspicious? One of the things is the slogans, Jesus is Lord, is considered seditious against Caesar, as in suggesting Caesar is not Lord. Also, the Christians would avoid civic celebrations and public rituals because they were focused on celebrating the Roman or Greek pantheon or offering sacrifices to the recently deceased emperor. And so these things are understood to be unifying for the empire. It would be like someone in the States, like poo-pooing on the 4th of July and making a statement of not celebrating the 4th of July. That would be really suspicious, and you wonder, why would you do that? That's kind of how the Christians would have been perceived. Like, are you trying to overthrow the government? No, they weren't, but that's kind of how it would come across. Also, there were these rumors going around because the Christians would celebrate in closed doors. The Eucharist, for example, or communion, was an exclusive celebration for the baptized Christians only. And it was behind closed doors. And so if you weren't a baptized Christian, you didn't know what was going on in there. And of course, rumors start going around because they had access to the New Testament writings. At this time, there was no New Testament, but we had all those books were still circulating. And so we had those notions of Jesus saying, "This is my body." Also, they would hear Christians referring to each other as brother, sister, even their spouses as brother and sister, and greet each other with the holy kiss. And so there's rumors that here, Theophilus of Antioch, one of these apologists, he actually summarizes their rumors by saying this: alleging that the wives of us all are held in common and made promiscuous use of, and that we even commit incest with our own sisters, and what is most impious and barbarous of all, that we eat human flesh. These were the rumors that the Christians had to deal with. To say, I'm a Christian, people might assume, oh, you're a cannibal, or you regularly have sex with your sister. People didn't like this. This was, what is wrong with these Christians? And so, also, in addition to all this, there were people who were writing treatises and letters and pamphlets against the Christians, trying to argue against them, and doing probably a very good job. People who were very well trained in rhetoric, very well trained in philosophy, writing arguments to critique the Christians. For example, focusing on the notion Christians worship a crucified person, calling him a god. Now, even from the pagan perspective, whether or not he's a god or not is beside the point. This guy was crucified. He was a criminal, condemned in a court, properly condemned, and then crucified. And Christians worship that person. That doesn't make sense to a pagan. It doesn't, it's completely mind-boggling. Now, obviously, that's not an accurate representation, but that's how they would have perceived it. Another factor is Mary wasn't a virgin. Mary was raped by a Roman soldier. That's another critique that was circulating. And then also that the Jews, because the Old Testament was adopted by the church, that the Old Testament and the Jewish writings was merely copied from the Greeks. Anything good in the Old Testament was merely borrowed and copied from Plato and others. And we will deal with one guy, Celsus, who wrote a very powerful work during this time period. That Origen later is someone who actually gave a very strong and very well thought out response to it. So, what were the apologists' response? How did they respond to these things? So again, like I said, mainly it's within the 2nd century. Now, within these arguments, we have the early developments of the Trinitarian theology. We actually are starting to see developing our notion of the Trinity. God is 3 in 1. Because that was being accused. How do you have a Father and the Son and both God and the Spirit? How does that work? So, of course, Christians were thought to be nonsense. And so the early apologists developed this notion called Logos theology, building off of John chapter 1, that the Logos, the Word, became flesh. We'll talk more about that in our next video with Justin Martyr. And so they also then turned the accusation of nonsense and debauchery back on the pagans, saying, okay, even if what you're saying that our practices are right, they're not, but let's just say for sake of argument they are right, look at what your gods do. Look at all the stories of your gods. They're even worse. All right, Zeus is married to his sister and sleeps around with his other sisters and even his daughter, and it's just messed up. So how do you even have a leg to stand on to accuse us of being debauched when you celebrate and worship gods that are way worse? And then another one is the critique that the Jews copied the Greeks. They actually flipped that on their head as well, suggesting that, well, the Jewish writings are much older than Plato. Plato is in the 3 and 400s BC. The Jewish writings were long before that. Remember, the Jews had already rebuilt Jerusalem after the exile by the time Plato came on the scene. So, and there is even a suggestion in the early church that Plato had traveled to Egypt and met up with Jews. Theophilus of Antioch, I quoted earlier, he says this: "The later born poets and philosophers stole from the Holy Scriptures to make their doctrines worthy of credit." And then Justin Martyr, he says this: "It was from our teachers that Plato borrowed his statement that God, having altered matter which was shapeless, made the world. And the physiological discussion in the Timaeus of Plato he borrowed in like manner from Moses." So Plato talked to Jews, heard about Genesis and stuff, and then he wrote his philosophy, kind of stealing from the Jews. And so also through this, I've mentioned about how the Eucharist was celebrated, giving some hints about that. We have those descriptions from these apologetic writings because they, in response to saying the Christians are doing this behind closed doors, the apologists said, actually, this is what we do. And Justin Martyr, we will talk about that with him. He actually does walk through a typical church service at that time. So stay tuned for the next video for a brief overview of how the early church celebrated and worshipped. And yeah, so just a quick overview, some apologists that are worth looking at. We have, of course, Justin Martyr and his disciple Tatian also wrote some things. I did a video earlier about Melito of Sardis. And then we have Quadratus is probably the earliest one. He wrote a letter to Hadrian, so even before Antoninus Pius. Another great one is Athenagoras of Athens, and then I've mentioned Theophilus of Antioch. Another cool thing with Theophilus is he is the first one to use the word triad to refer to God. So this is actually the origin of then the developing of the Trinity, to say God is a triad. We don't have the word Trinity yet because that was a Latin word, but in Greek, triados, as for God, in the year 180. And then, of course, there's a letter called the Epistle to Diognetus. Unfortunately, we don't know who Diognetus was or who wrote the letter, but it's a beautiful letter that defends the Christian faith, and we know it dates to this period. Also, the first Latin apologist, Minucius Felix, and then, of course, Tertullian later, but he was a bit more of a philosopher and theologian as well as an apologist. We'll get into those later videos. And stay with me. Look forward to the next video on Justin Martyr.